Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be teaching you how to create this watercolor Japanese inspired landscape. Not only will you need watercolors for this tutorial, I used white acrylic paint, pink acrylic paint and a Posco gel pen just to add the finishing touches. These are not essential, you can complete this whole tutorial with watercolor, but having these couple of extra bits is just going to make life a little bit easier. So I'm going to jump straight into the tutorial. Let me know how you found it down below in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more nature art themed watercolour content. To begin with, I wanted to create a really nice, bright, vibrant background. So to do this, I used a combination of pink and grey. I used my crimson for the pink and added some white to this, and to create the grey, I mixed black, blue and white. I really wanted to make sure I included white for a more muted colour palette, more pastel colours, not to lighten, and this is really important to note for this particular tutorial, as if you want to lighten watercolour, all you need to do is add water and less paint. That combination creates the light shadows, but for this piece I really wanted everything to be that really nice pastel combination. So I used the wet in wet method for the background. This means I added a light layer of water down and then went in with these two colours and I blended them together. First I went in with that grey for the top section and then the pink for the bottom and merged them together in the middle. I also didn't work all the way out to the edge of my paper. I did add water all the way out and then put a few dots coming out from the actual background, as I really wanted that blurred effect. I think this really helped bring the piece to life rather than having that crisp edge that you can create with washi tape. But this is personal preference. If that is something you do want to do, it's not an issue. Whatever you think will bring your piece to life and make your piece unique, I would definitely recommend. And I also didn't add any details to that background yet, as we want things to dry before you go in and add the little lines that you can see for the shadows, as they'll just blur out at this stage because the paper is still wet. So once you're happy with this background, I then use that same light grey to paint in the stones that are above that. So if you do look at the reference photo, there's a faint horizontal line that shows where the ground starts to really push up, where you've got like them little cliffs in the background, or like that upward round shape. So I'm focusing on the second part of that background now. And you'll notice I come back to this in stages, letting it dry each time and then painting in more as I go. And I did this to allow drying time between each stone, so they were never touching when they were wet, and this helps really distinguish each individual stone rather than painting them all at once. It's all going to bleed together, create just a mess of colour, and it will start looking more like the background we've just painted in with that gentle wash. You do want to be able to see them stones individually, so this is the best way to do that. Having each stone really stand out, it's just going to bring a different element to the painting rather than all that detail being where the trees are. Once I was happy with this section, I then created a really nice earth green and added some brown to this to get it as dark as possible, but you still want that green pushing through. And then I created the exact same colour and added a little bit of blue so it was a little bit colder, and you've got that combination of the two different greens, but they're still equally as dark. And I started painting this in. I used that slightly more earthy green to begin with. If you use the outlines that I've provided, the link down in the description, you'll be able to follow the lines that I am creating. And I wasn't too worried about getting every single element completely accurate in terms of colour. I did let it flow and do its own thing. If I went over the line, for example, that I'd mapped in with the reference, I wasn't too worried about this, as this is that background and all the colours are very similar, so you can't really tell that things are different. So I used that earth green and then straight after went in with that colder green. Got that lovely combination of colour, and where the areas are slightly lighter, I used a dark grey that I pre-mixed, the exact same as I did for the other grey. This time I didn't add as much white, so it was a little bit more on that grey side. And I painted right up to where the cherry blossoms were. Again, if you've got that outline, you can paint around all these lines I'm putting for you to see where these trees and the leaves are going to go. And I left the tree trunks bare, as this is a different colour that we'll be adding in later, and we really want them trees to stand out because they are at the forefront of the painting. But as long as you get these shadows right, you can't really go wrong with this. I would also advise that when you're painting with the green, I put a lot of lines going downwards, so it looked like it was downhill. Everything's very consistent with that. It's a really good way to have that ground stand out with that consistency, and you've still got all the different layers of colour, but it looks like it's all moving the same direction. And as I came more to the left hand side, I actually thought there was a lot more grey in there, so instead of using the greens to begin with, I used that dark grey as the base layer. So there's a lot more of that grey on that side, and then added the green over the top. So whatever colour you use first is going to be that main colour, the main attribute to that section. And of course I blended out the sides with some water, so where that green finishes I used a clean brush, blended it out, added some dots into the wet section, so again you've got the wet in wet method creeping through, and it just looks like everything's really blurring out on all of the edges of this piece. So now that background is in there, I want to bring our attention to the forefront of the painting, particularly the trees that the cherry blossoms are attached to, them tree trunks. So I used that really dark grey, lightened it a little bit, and then put this down using vertical strokes, vertical lines. So everything's very consistent in terms of that tree trunk, and then I mixed a brown with that grey, so you've got the consistency in terms of colour, and added a few lines over the top of this. And I did this for them 3 main branches. I think the first 2 actually either side of the whole painting stand out the most, but there's that one in the middle that just creeps through, so I darkened that up a lot more to match up to the rest of the background. But them 2, you really want them to stand out amongst that green, and having this grey be lighter than that is going to help that happen. And also because the paper is still wet, as we're adding them brown lines in, they're really going to blend into the grey, so you don't want to add too many as it will all just merge and you'll have just that brown sitting over the top. But adding a few lines, you can see them creeping through, but they still blend out as the paper is wet. And then I went in and painted the branches above these tree trunks that go into the area where the cherry blossoms are going to go. As you can see as well, I'm leaving a lot of gaps for these branches because you want them blossoms to sit nicely over the top of this. Because watercolour is translucent, you will be able to see the grey underneath the pink, but later on you'll see I went in with acrylic paint to tidy all this up and bring it all together. So you don't need to worry too much if you've got acrylic paint, but if you don't have acrylic paint, anything you add down you will be able to still see, even with that pink over the top. And I didn't add too many branches actually. I think I could have added a lot more, but I really wanted the blossoms to take over and be at the forefront, and it's best to add a little, go in later and add more detail if you wanted to with these blossoms, and adding branches to connect it all together. So now I'm going to swiftly move down to this deer that we painted around earlier on, and the reason I'm jumping back and forth is to allow drying time. So now the branches are drying, so we can move on to painting in this deer, and I used that light grey just to map in the general shape. You can see the shape of the deer has formed really quickly just from doing that general outline. I've avoided the whites of the deer, but everything else I've painted the exact same colour, and then we can add the highlights into that later. And then again, jumping to the background where there's that section left around the stones, I used the wet in wet method to add a little bit more grey and darken this as we go further into the dark green areas. So you've got that really nice flow of different shades of colour. So it's filling in the rest of that space now. So adding in all of the stones that we might have missed due to the drying time we've allowed, blurring out some of the background, adding in that dots as it does blur out, neatening in some of the trees up maybe, you can add more lines to this. It's just going in and filling all the space really. Anything that's underneath them cherry blossoms, we're going to treat that as a separate section because there is that little bit more to it with the blossoms going over the top of the background. If you're enjoying this tutorial so far, make sure you check out all of the links down below in the description. You can find links to my Patreon, all of my social media pages, as over on my Patreon I upload weekly real-time nature art themed tutorials, including all of the landscape piece series that I'm currently creating for you guys over here on YouTube. So if you're wanting to watch this tutorial in more depth, make sure you check that out. And there's also a variety of different tutorials on there, including flower paintings, animal drawings. Yeah, there's a lot to check out. And then on my social media, particularly TikTok, you can find out everything I get up to day to day for my art business. And finally, don't forget to let me know how you found this video down below in the comments. If there's anything you want to see in the future, you can let me know down there as well. If you have any questions about this art tutorial, anything like that, just let me know down below in the comments and I will let you know as best I can how to help. Jumping again back to the deer now, I used that dark brown that we used to add the lines into the trees to add the shadows into the deer. As there is quite a lot of brown, yes, we have that grey as the base coat, but this brown is going to really help bring everything to life and really get them colours as accurate as possible. So I followed around the grey, adding in shadows in more areas by adding more paint. Some areas I didn't add the paint, so it is okay to still have that grey in the background as long as you've got that combination and them shadows in the right places following the reference photo. It was mainly around the face and legs, I would say, towards the top of the body as well, and this is a really good way just to bring that deer to life. Then pre-mixed a really bright pink using crimson and white. Again, this isn't to make the colour lighter, this is to create more of a pastel like colour, and it's actually changing the colour, not the shadow. If you're wanting to change the shadow, all you need to do is add more water to get it lighter, or less water and more paint to keep things darker. So it does make things a lot different by adding that white. And I just added small little dots to replicate that blossom shape. Followed the reference photo in terms of the structure, but I wasn't too worried about getting everything completely accurate. I actually had a lot of fun with this. I just dotted it down following them branches. So what I mean by this is where the branches are coming out from the tree trunk, then added lots of dots more towards this so it looks like it's following the branches. But I also added some everywhere really, wherever I wanted to, wherever it looked really natural to do so. And then I gave this a couple of minutes to dry and I went in with them dark greens again, a combination of both of them dots, and I added a few dots in between all of the pink and that negative space. And I did this so you could then see that background creeping through, as we don't want to have put so much detail into all that background below and then just have pink above. You want that background to merge into the cherry blossoms. And then once I was satisfied with this, I used some white acrylic paint. I changed my paintbrush for this, as I do think it is good to have separate brushes for different mediums, and I dotted this over a lot of that pink. I let some of it creep through, but I wanted more of a natural effect, and dotting this over that dark green really made the blossoms come to life. It was so nice to have that white contrast to the dark greens below. And I also created a baby pink with that acrylic, so I added a little bit of pink to the white, pink acrylic paint I should say, to white, and dotted this in there as well so you didn't lose that pink element, and it meant the flow between the white and the pink was then really natural. I then used a fine tip white pen to add a few dots below the cherry blossoms so it looks like the blossoms are falling to the ground. And this is only a really small step, but I think it really contributed to the overall piece and tied everything together and gave it a beautiful effect. And it also matches up to the dots we put during that blend out. So I think it tied everything together really nicely. And like I say, the look of the blossoms falling to the floor is beautiful. I added a couple of lines with the light grey just to add detail to the ground. I mentioned this towards the start of the video, just adding a little bit more detail, tied everything together. I also didn't blend out the tops of the cherry blossoms as this was the focal point. I didn't want this to blend out, and I love that everything below that blends out at the edges. And there we have it guys, thank you so much for watching this tutorial. Please don't forget to let me know how you found it in the comments, and I will see you next time for more nature art themed content. Bye!